listener production.
Hello, Antoinette Lattouf with you. Welcome to The Briefing. So pretty much everyone in politics now agrees that the ballooning cost of the National Disability Insurance Scheme is becoming unsustainable long term. There's been plenty of noise from the NDIS Minister and other politicians about what taxpayers should and should not fund under the scheme. But, of course, in the middle of all of this, there are real people whose lives are affected by their decisions.
Sexual wellness is quite an important part of who we are as humans, and I believe denying someone that right to have that kind of intimacy or even education is really detrimental.
In the second half of this episode, we find out what access to a sex worker has meant for the life of an Australian with cerebral palsy and what he thinks taxpayers should and shouldn't pay for. First, though, Simon Beaton is here with us to talk through today's top news stories. It is Wednesday, July the 10th.
Hi, Antoinette. A new study has revealed 1 in 5 have committed sexual violence. That's according to a survey of 5,000 Australians between the ages of 18 and 45, and almost 10% admitted to doing so in the last year. So the report was done by the Australian Institute of Criminology, and respondents were asked about things like pressuring someone to drink or take drugs before sex, but it also included recording and sharing intimate images and videos.
Yeah, that's a kind of pretty distressing figure, 1 in 5. And that age group, Simon, of 18 to 45 was used because researchers wanted an age where participants were likely to have had access to the internet and therefore porn during their formative years. And unsurprisingly, men were significantly more likely to have committed this behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Ant, that I'm quite glad that research on perpetrators is being undertaken and it's not just on the victim survivors, and also that so much emphasis is being placed on coercive behaviours. When we were teens, I know that quite often persuading someone, which really is pressuring into a sexual act, was often seen almost as part of the game. And I think that anything that we can do to shift that culture is something that should be done.
Yeah, especially in light of the fact that 36,000 people reported sexual assault just last year. And if you or someone you know needs help or support, you can call 1-800-RESPECT, which is 1-800-737-732. Distressing CCTV footage of police repeatedly striking an Indigenous teenager with a baton has been revealed by ABC's 7:30 program. So the 17-year-old is locked up in a Brisbane police watch house and he's in a room with no fresh air or sunlight. And at the time, he was accused of car theft. The footage shows him being struck repeatedly with a baton after yelling out from his cell. And these images have been described by Queensland's Family and Child Commissioner as abhorrent and distressing. You can also then see the teenager collapsing to the floor. And these holding cells, they're meant, Simon, for adults to spend up to 3 days in while they're waiting to have some time before court or to be transferred to a prison. But this teenager was in there for 5 days when this police violence allegedly occurred.
So police have investigated the incident, overseen by the state's corruption watchdog, and say the use of force was lawful and reasonable and that the teen had sworn at police and grabbed one by the waist in the tussle. Now there's growing pressure, though, for another investigation. The PM has announced that Jillian Segel will become Australia's first special envoy to combat antisemitism.
Antisemitism erodes all that is good and healthy in a society. As such, it poses a threat not just to the Jewish community, but to our entire nation.
That was Jillian, who is a lawyer and businesswoman and the immediate past president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Anti-Semitism was growing before October 7th and has continued to increase. At the same time, Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment and attacks have soared. The PM on social media has said an envoy to deal with that is coming sometime later.
Yeah, and the Jewish Council of Australia, which is a progressive organisation that wants a ceasefire and an end to killing of Palestinians and an end to the occupation, has flagged some concerns about this appointment, saying, to quote, "We're concerned this anti-Semitism envoy will fail to distinguish between Jewishness and support for Israel, and that it risks erasing a large number of Jewish people in Australia who believe in Palestinian freedom and justice."
Yes, the Jewish Council also described Jillian Segel, who has been appointed to lead this envoy, as an Israel lobbyist. It's important to point, our Attorney General Mark Dreyfus did raise the point that not all criticism of Israel and the war was anti-Semitic.
I criticise the government of Israel from time to time. I don't think I'm anti-Semitic. Other people criticise the government of Israel and I don't think they're anti-Semitic. But when people are singling out Israel and applying a standard to Israel that they do not apply to other countries, then potentially there's anti-Semitism going on.
Look, I think combating all forms of racism and hate is incredibly important. I did find it interesting that this special envoy to combat anti-Semitism was announced. And then the Prime Minister was like, oh, yes, and we'll do the Islamophobia thing later. And I was like, well, just by virtue of prioritising one over another continues to create division and works against social cohesion. So, yeah, that certainly raised my eyebrows.
And Australia has accused a Chinese spy agency of repeated cyber attacks against our government as well as private businesses. There are multiple attacks that they've linked, including one in 2022 that saw hundreds of usernames and passwords stolen. Information was released by the Australian Signals Directorate, which is one of our secret services, making mention of activities by this notorious group known as APT40, who are believed to be linked to China's Ministry of State Security.
Yeah, so this statement is a pretty significant escalation of international pushback against Beijing's activities. And it's also the first Australian-led direct technical attribution of malicious cyber activity to a Chinese state-sponsored actor. And Simon, we're not the only ones who've called China out either. We have support from the US, the UK, Germany, South Korea and Japan in this investigation.
But a spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Canberra has said that we oppose any groundless smears and accusations against China, and also that keeping the cyberspace safe is a global challenge. And in fact, China is a major victim of cyber attacks. It will be interesting to see if China push back harder against the accusations.
Thanks, Simon. It's time for our deep dive with Bensian, who looks at the NDIS and whether paying for a sex worker for those with disability should be included.
You don't want to pay for someone to have a wild old night between the sheets on the taxpayer's ticket when it actually comes with a bill. I think we were on a Unity ticket for that.
That was Nationals MP Barnaby Joyce on Sunrise. It followed NDIS Minister Bill Shorten promising to ban funding sex work services for people with disability under the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The NDIS is the massive government program that funds services for Australians with a disability, both to meet their medical needs and to help them live full and independent lives. It's in the news right now because no matter your political stripe, there's pretty broad agreement that it needs some urgent reform, mainly around how much taxpayer money is used to fund it, how effective that money is, and what the priority should be for people with disability. 4 years ago, the federal court ruled that sex work services can be funded through the NDIS if they're deemed reasonable and necessary. It is by all accounts a very small chunk of the money spent on the NDIS, but it looks like it will be banned as part of the government's review of the scheme. Oliver Morton Evans lives in Sydney and has cerebral palsy, and across the years has used paid sex work to help him experience sexual intimacy. He also works as a referral officer with Touching Base, an organisation that connects people with disability to sex workers across the country. So, why does he think people on the NDIS should be able to use their funding to seek sex work? Oliver, thanks so much for joining us. Before we get into the politics, can you tell us about the first time that you commissioned a sex worker?
Yeah, so I was in my very early 20s and I was finding it really hard to make connections that were sexual. So with women, I went to all boys' schools, so it's very hard to be connected with women. So I believe it was actually a support worker that gave me this idea. And after many years of deliberating around it, I decided to do that. And honestly, it was a very liberating experience for me.
Why did you feel that you needed to do that or that you wanted to do that? Can you take us to the time that you were deliberating about it?
Sure. So growing up in the 90s, it was a lot less progressive in the thinking back then. And really, disability was often regarded as non-sexual, and by a society, I was seen really as a non-sexual being. However, I knew that not to be true. So there was quite a lot of mental health stuff going on for me around that, because I knew that obviously not to be true, but I found it very difficult to overcome the barriers faced with showing not only that I was capable of that, but also just meeting people that wanted to be more of an understanding.
Was it anxiety inducing? Was it scary the first time?
Definitely. As anyone's first sexual experience usually is. Obviously, more so probably because this was a complete stranger, and it was in a brothel, so a completely foreign environment as well. And as a person who gets around in a wheelchair and relies on support to pretty much do anything physical, it's quite a vulnerable situation. So yeah, definitely a bit of anxiety there.
You also now work to connect people with disability to sex workers. Can you identify, without identifying anyone specifically, an example of the impact that has had on someone else's life?
For sure. In fact, I helped a woman, I believe about a month ago. She was in regional WA, and she put it through a request to help find her a sex worker. She, I believe, was late 30s, did not possess arms or legs, and she had never had sex before, and she wanted to find a male sex worker to have this experience for the first time. Yeah, I mean, that's quite profound. We don't know the outcome of that, but definitely that she wanted to experience that was, it's very, really important.
So you were speaking about this experience that you had in your 20s. This was well before the NDIS started. How did you afford it, and how much did it cost at the time, around about?
So obviously back then, it was all self-funded. If anyone wanted to see a sex worker, it was really governed by whether you could afford it or not. I was looking at, thousands of dollars per session. So I could really only have that kind of experience once or twice a year.
In your current job, speaking with people and connecting them to sex workers, is your understanding that people mostly privately fund it now, or are NDIS funds used for it often?
From what we see, people are still largely paying for it privately, and it's only a very, very small fraction of people that can indeed have it funded through NDIS. But I believe the people that can have it funded through NDIS definitely should be having it funded. It's still very discriminatory against wealthy, honestly, people that can afford sexual services. And honestly, many people with disabilities simply can't afford it.
Do you know around about ballpark how much it might cost nowadays to access a sex worker for a person with disability?
I believe it might be anywhere between $500 and $2,000.
The NDIS Minister Bill Shorten is currently working through a review of unnecessary spending in the NDIS, and sex work is in the spotlight as something that might need to go. Why should the NDIS pay for sex work?
I definitely believe it, and from my own experience, I believe sexual wellness is a really important part of someone's overall health. It's been shown that having an active sexual life where someone can actively express their sexuality leads to less depression, less anxiety, and less self-esteem issues. And I believe for people with disability, these are major issues faced. So anything to help with that is, in my mind, reasonable and necessary. And really, the government definitely needs to look at its narrow-minded views on sexual wellness.
What would be your response to someone who says, as a taxpayer, I don't want to fund this kind of service?
I would challenge that person's view around sex and sexuality. I believe, like I said, sexual wellness is quite an important part of who we are as humans. And I believe denying someone that right to have that kind of intimacy or even education is really detrimental and really puts disabled people in an even more vulnerable position.
Do you view sex or sexual well-being as a human right?
Yes, I do. I believe that someone's sexuality is an integral part of who they are, pretty similar to other aspects of a human identity and health. And I believe someone's sexuality can quite deeply affect someone's mental health. And I think it's really important that we can have these conversations around sex and sexuality in the open, and for people to be able to express this part of themselves.
And finally, do you believe that people, including politicians without a disability, are listening to people like you?
Unfortunately, no. On the whole, no, I don't. I believe there's still a lot of ableist rhetoric and really a lack of understanding around disability and around the potential for disabled people to thrive and to live the life that they want. I see too often people with disabilities being portrayed as victims, and I would like to see politicians seek to empower people with disabilities more, to be more really integrated into mainstream society. And I think this is definitely one way that can happen.
What's your message to Bill Shorten?
My message is really to expand his thinking and to really understand that sexual wellness is of critical and really reasonable and necessary for people with disabilities that require NDIS funding for this service. So this is really important, and not only that, but it's a very small budget compared to the much wider problems that the NDIS is facing.
Oliver, thanks so much for your time speaking on the briefing.
Thank you.
Oliver Morton-Evans there. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can also check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. I'm Ben Sion Siebert. Catch you next time.